Hello and welcome to the Django Project e-commerce store. So this is the first project of 2021 e-commerce store version 1. So to give you an overview of what's going to happen here in this project and the new way of working here for 2021, I'm going to set out this project in 3 stages. So there's going to be 3 tutorials or 3 areas or 3 videos for this project, and that's develop the basic application. That's what we're going to achieve in this tutorial, and then we're going to then build the shopping cart functionality, go through all that type of development process, and then we're going to head into part 3, and that's the payment portals. So in this project there's going to be 3 core areas or 3 core tutorials. The first tutorial, this tutorial, we're going to develop the basic application. Then in the second tutorial, we're going to focus on creating a shopping cart functionality or the shopping cart functionality. And then in the last section, we'll have a look at payment portals. So connecting our application to a payment portal so we can accept payments within our application. Once we've completed the 3 core stages here, you'll have a usable working e-commerce store where you'll be able to take payments for products inside of your e-commerce store and then send confirmation of those payments to the user. Now 4, 5, etc. At this point, once we've done the core stages, we can then have a look at some additionalities. So I wanted to kind of front load the core sections at the start of the project so that when we have a look at the additionalities, we can maybe make changes that we don't want to affect the next section, for example. So we don't necessarily have to have this in some sort of order. We can look at different aspects that you might want to include in the project and make those into kind of individual tutorials. Okay, so let's get started with part 1. So like I said, if you're familiar with Django and creating basic templates and testing and views, etc., then you might want to skip to part 2. Just download the code for part 1 and start with part 2. Now, if you are new to Django, hopefully I will create an environment here for you whereby you'll be able to get started with Django and start building this project. Now, I'm going to try and cover as much as possible here in the first part. We'll start by getting Django started and building a new project. We're then, of course, going to have a look at models and then create a simple admin area for our models so we can start adding data to our database. So we'll have a look at how we can import images and set up the media folder so that we can actually upload images to our project. So I do want to include testing in all of the projects this year. So we will go through the basics of testing, and this first instance will be testing our models. Now this is a kind of an optional step, so you don't have to have testing to get the code running, of course, but it is a good piece of knowledge or a good stage to kind of go through and become familiar with testing in Django and Python. So we'll use coverage, the package coverage, to help us and guide us in what needs testing, and I'll go through some of the basics there. And then we'll move across and build our URLs and our views, and then start to bring in our templates. Now we are going to be utilizing Bootstrap again as our framework, our CSS HTML framework, so that we can quickly build views. So this isn't a CSS or HTML guide at all. I'm going to take you through the steps of utilizing Bootstrap and what changes you need to make, but I'm going to try and concentrate on the Python code and the Django code. So once that's done, we'll do some final testing of our views, and then I'll give you a little bit of information about Python style conventions, and we'll install some applications or store some packages and just test our code to make sure it meets the PEP 8 standards. So that's, again, a little bit of an optional step there for you, but it's just kind of good practice to start thinking about Python styling or code styling. So by the end of this tutorial, you're going to have a project that looks a little bit like this. So this is the home page here. We have some links. We've got a drop down here. This category, a list. So this is dynamically produced from our database. At the moment, I've only got one category called Django. So that allows me to take me to the Django books. So this is a bookstore, as you've probably seen. So I've got some books here, 2 books, and we can click on these books and then that would take us to the individual page. So at this point, we can't in this stage. We'll look at this in the second tutorial where we can add this to the basket and track our basket before we can then make payments. So you can see that we've got the template in place for us to kind of start performing those actions in the second tutorial. Now we don't have any search. This is going to be an additional kind of function we can add much later into our project. But essentially that's what we have. We have a home page where we can view the books that we have. And of course, there could be plenty more here. We've got the search, or sorry, the category functionality. And then we have the individual page where we can add the products to the basket. So now you've seen what we're going to build. Let's get started. So here we are then in Visual Studio Code. So first of all, let's have a look at the extensions here that I'm running. So I've got the Atom 1 dark theme. I don't think I've actually applied that yet, but I've downloaded that. I've got the Django extension here. So this is in extensions. Just search for the extension and download it. So this is going to give us a few different features here. And when we're coding in Django, it's going to highlight some code, for example, and tell me what the code does. And it's maybe going to give me suggestions on what code I need to use. For example, what options I have available. Okay, so other things that would be useful here. I've got SQLite to allow me to kind of have a look into the database and the data within the database, so I can view the SQLite database. And then in addition to that, we've got Python here. So that's also pretty useful for us to install, and that's going to provide us some linting. So it's going to just let us know when potentially we made a mistake, for example, and formatting, for example, is going to help us with a little bit of formatting, a style convention, and so on. So those are the kind of the key extensions. You don't have to include them, of course, but it can be handy to have them. So go ahead and file, open a new folder, create a new folder, select the folder, and here we are. So we have a new project folder. So let's go ahead now, and in the terminal, you can see that I'm using Windows. This is going to be very similar on other operating systems, of course. So what we need to do is we need to first of all create a virtual environment. So here I'm running whatever the latest version of Python is at this point. So let's just have a look. Python version. So I'm using 3.9 Python. So what I'm going to be doing is setting out a virtual machine, of course, to begin with. So using the M flag here, because I'm going to be referencing a piece of software, for example. So I'm going to create a new virtual environment. The folder is called VEMV. So let's go ahead and do that. There we go. So this virtual environment allows me to kind of work within a smaller package area, so I can install individual packages away from the main kind of computer and the main version of Python on my machine. So let's go ahead now and run the activation. So we're going to activate the virtual machine here, or the virtual environment, sorry. So there we go. So now I'm in the virtual environment. Now I can actually install Django. So I run pip install Django. That's going to allow me to then run or download from the package manager, or with the package manager pip, download Django onto my machine. So now Django is now installed. We can have a look in the lib here. You can see Django now has been installed. So I'll be able to access the Django admin in here. So I can do that by typing in Django -admin. And then I want to start a new project. So start project. And then I'm going to call this project core. And then what I also want to do is not to forget the space and then a full stop here. That's going to make the project folder inside of this folder that I built, and not in an additional folder. There we go. So if I didn't use the full stop, I'd made a new folder called core, and then core would have been inside of that. So I just didn't want to work that way. I prefer to work this way. So I've got the managed Py file now available. That's going to allow me access to the Django admin and functionality. And then I've got the core, my core application. So I want to go ahead and build a store. So now I can use the manage Py command to now start a new app. So I'm now going to start a new app, and I'm going to call this a store. There we go. So you can see now a new folder has appeared. Excellent. So this is where I'm going to build up my model, my database, and so on. So I'll just go ahead and in the settings of core, I'm just going to register this application so Django knows to scan this project folder store for any model changes, any models, any database files that I build. So let's go ahead and add it to our list here. Now you can add it to the top or the bottom. At this point, it doesn't really matter. So there we go. So now I've now registered our store. So it will now detect any changes I make when I build some models. So now we need to build some initial models for our project. So these models, these classes that we're going to build, these are the instructions for Django or the templates for Django to then create the actual tables in our database. So we're going to describe the tables in a class to build tables in our database. So I've already pre-coded this. Now I know some people prefer me to type out all the code, but I just think it's easier to work this way. If I just describe the code in a block, you can then pause the video, have a look at the code, write it out, and then rewind if you need to understand a little bit more about it again. So plus it just makes it the video a lot quicker if I were just to explain each block at a time. Plus I find it really hard to explain and type at the same time, and I don't see there being a need for me to have spaces in this tutorial whereby I'm just typing. It seems like a waste of time. So let's go ahead and build a new class called category, because we're building a shop here. So we need some tables for our products, and we just need to think about how we're going to manage those products. So we're going to need 2 tables initially, I think, or at least we can start off with 2 tables. Category table, so that we can record the categories that we have in our shop for our products. And then we're going to create a products table, and then of course connect our products table to the category, because we want to be able to define a category within our product, but we know that there's going to be multiple categories. Now, if you're not familiar with databases, this is going to look and sound and feel pretty strange. It does help if you do have some kind of database knowledge, or you're at least able to understand the basics of database in terms of tables and just basic connectivity, things like foreign keys, for example. It does make it rather hard to work in Django initially if you're not too familiar with this. And modeling your data is really important to make sure that later on in the product, in your development, that the data is set in a way that you don't have to kind of go back and make so many changes, because a database is something that you don't really want to make too many changes with later on, or we want to try and avoid them as much as possible, because it can be quite a long-winded process making changes in your database. So at this stage, there are some other additional tutorials that you can have a look at. So the models kind of series and the ORM series, that's going to help guide you on utilizing models in Django. But let's just go ahead now and flesh this out. So here we're making a new table essentially here, but we're describing it here with Python, and Django is going to do the rest for us. So we're extending from models. That's going to provide us access to kind of the functionality that we're going to need to build a model and describe a model. So first of all, our category. So what do we need to record about a category? We need the name. So here we use a name of the category, and then we're just going to, you can see this is a variable name, and then we're going to basically describe the data type of our name, which is going to be a character field. Means that we're going to type in characters inside of this field, and then we're going to describe some additionalities here. So max length 255, db index true. Okay, so we've got 2 parameters there. Now there are a number of different parameters that we could include here. So if you're not too sure what these are, just head over to, or just copy and paste these into the Django documentation, and you'll be able to find out more about all the different attributes. So let's go ahead and also add a slug. So in order to get to the category, we want to kind of type into the browser. So we want to be able to kind of type into the browser here the name of the category. So for example, Django. So this is what a slug is. So this here is referring to the slug name. So what name are we going to type here in order to get to that category resource? Because we want to show all the items in this category, for example, Django or React or whatever. So this is what the slug is for. And that's why we've included it right here. So you can see I'm using a slug field. This is obviously different from a character field. Now a slug field, this is just going to be behind the scenes describing what should be inside of this field. So a slug field shouldn't include special characters that you can't include when you type in to your. So for example, here we can't use special characters like this, for example. So you would imagine by defining here the slug field behind the scenes, that's basically going to ensure that whatever you type here kind of meets that formatting style when we enter it into a database. So here we go ahead and we do max length again. Now this time included this unique equals true. So unique means that in the database here, there should only be one slug with, for example, the word Django, because otherwise we have a problem potentially. We have two categories with the same name. So when we're trying to actually direct users to the category, Django isn't going to know what data to produce or to display because there's going to be two categories with the same name. So we want to make that unique. So these are the type of things that we can start to add into our database. Okay, so second to all the different fields, that's pretty much all the fields that we're going to need to begin with. Here we have the class meta. So this is additional kind of metadata, data about data that we can include in our project, or sorry, in our model. So basically just more instructions that we can provide Django about our model here, about our table. So here is just the plural name. So I'm just setting the plural name for category, because what's going to happen is by default, Django is going to put an S on the end of this. Obviously, that's not the correct way of spelling categories. So we can override that setting. That's what I've done right here. So behind the scenes, and when we go into the admin area, it will say categories and not category, for example. If I remember, I'll just showcase where that might be utilized. So down here, and we've also got this absolute URL. So these are just other parameters, which I'll explain a little bit later. Let me just zoom out so you can see it, for example. So I'm just going to remove that for now. We'll add that later. So finally, what we're going to include is a dunderstring method here. So what's going to happen is that we will return data from this database. Now, by default, we return the data. Now, this data is going to have two components. So if we return that data, how can we refer to that data that's returned? So what we can do is basically just specify how we can set the default name that gets returned when we return the data. So if we return one piece of data from this database table, we could reference it by, in this case, the name. So again, I'll point this out and I'll show you where that's being utilized and how that's utilized and how it's useful later on in the project. So next up, we have our product table. So this is going to look a little bit like this. So class product. This is our second table. Now we're going to need a double space here because it's a class. So just following this style convention, Python style convention. So we've got product, models, model again. So extending from model. And now I've tried to utilize as many fields of varieties here just to give you a flavor of the different types of fields. So let's go ahead. And first of all, we're going to add a link here. So a field called category, and this is our foreign key over to the category. So what we're saying here is that we're going to build a load of categories, so 10, 20, 30 categories. Now we want to associate those categories to the product. So we don't want to add a new field here and add the word category and add different categories because we want the information to come from the category table. So we'd build a link between the product and the category table so that we can automatically select and include data here in the product, which is referenced to in the category table. So if we had a category here called Django, we basically can make a reference to that with a foreign key. Okay, so we can see here that we've got a related name. That will make it easier in our program to kind of name these relations or identify these relationships in different tables. And we've got onDelete equals model cascade. So what's going to happen here is that by default here we've set this up with model cascade. So what's going to happen here, and there's a few different settings here in the onDelete, and it'd be worth going into the Django documentation to have a look at these settings. So I won't go through them all because that's going to take too much time. But here, essentially what's happening is that we create a category. Now, the important thing here is if we don't have a category, we won't be able to have a product, because there needs to be this entry, this field needs to be populated in the database at all times. So there has to be a category. So when there isn't a category, it means that we're going to have to delete, or we're going to delete all the products that are inside of that category. So here we're just spelling out what to do, or what happens when, for example, we do change the category data. So if we do delete it, what happens to the product? So there's a few different things we can do here. And understanding a little bit more about this referential integrity in databases would be useful. But hopefully that gives you enough information just to get started. If this seems like too much information, don't worry about it. Let's just enjoy developing this application, getting something working, and then you can fill in the gaps later. Okay, so we've got that in. Let's go into the next one, created by. So what I'm going to do is the product is going to be added to the database. I want to record who actually made that data. So what I'm going to do in a second, what I've done here is I made a foreign key to the Django default user table. So again, this is building a connection to the Django user table, and I need to bring this in. I'll do this in a second so we've got access to the user table. So the default user table has all the users that you might set up in your Django application. So what I'm doing here is I'm building a foreign key to that table that Django builds automatically for us. And I'm basically then going to record who has actually made that product. So again, I've got the onDelete model cascade. So when I delete the user from the user table, it will also delete the product. And then I've got a related name again. You can see here, I've just put it in a different order to show there isn't really any order that you potentially need to follow. Okay, so next up, we've got some other parameters. So we're going to go ahead and write the title, or we're going to need a title of the product, the author. So we can also add a default. So maybe, remember, this is the author of the book, not the author of the product. So here we've got created by. This is the author of the book. So by default, if someone doesn't type something in, we can include some data. So that's just an example of that. So you may not want to follow that. Like I said, it's just an example. So here we have the description of the book. Now, this time I'm using a text field, which is a field that allows a lot more text, for example, than a character field potentially. So max length 255. So you'll find that the text field in database terms has a maximum character length of X, Y, Z. You can see I've used here because there's going to be a lot of text. So typically this is quite a large field, allowing you plenty of space to write text. So that's a description. So now I'm also going to bring in an image. I want to record an image in this product. So the reality here is that I'm just building a very simple application. Now I wouldn't necessarily bring the image in here because I would want to make a new table, maybe make an album table and connect that all up. So just to keep it simple for now, we're going to assume that the product only has one image because we're only able here to store one image potentially. So let's go ahead and just add this for now. And later on, maybe when we think about additions, step 4, 5, 6, etc., we can do that at a later date. So here's how to import an image. Notice it's an image field. So Django is going to handle that as an image field. That's going to allow us to upload images and associate them to this product. Now, what's important here is that we're not actually storing the image in the database. We're storing the link to the image. And we're going to have to set up that link system shortly in our Django project to allow us to upload images to a specific file. Now here you'll notice that I've added the attribute here, upload to, and then I've defined what folder to upload these images to. Okay, so let's go ahead and add the slug. So we know a little bit about the slug now. So the product is also going to have a slug, which means I can type in like the product name here, and that will then be utilized. This piece of information here can then be utilized, this slug, to actually present the individual item on the page. So that's how we're going to use it. And then we go ahead in stock. This is going to be a Boolean field. So a Boolean field is a true-false field. I can set the default to true. So is it in stock or not? Set it to true or false. So that could be useful information. Is active. So there might be some products that aren't actually active to buy. Maybe, for example, you've run out of stock. So that might be is stock. So depending on the situation here, you might change these parameters based upon what stock you want to sell, for example. So you need to think about what data you want to store to help you in the system and record and manage and track your data and your products that you're trying to sell. Okay, so we got created and updated. So what we've got here are two fields. One is going to be utilized when we actually build a new product. So the auto now add, that is only going to happen once. So that's only going to be fired off once or triggered once when we make the product. Now, what we want to do is if we make updates to our product, maybe we want to record that somehow. So we can do that by potentially creating an updated field and record the updates utilizing auto now. So that will be triggered every time we make an update for that particular product. So that's the difference there. So let's move on and now create some meta again. So we know about the plural name. Now we don't really need that here because Django will put the S on the end. So that's not really a problem, but we've added that in. And now I've added in ordering. So ordering here, we can order, when we return all the data from this product, we can specify what order we want that data to be in. And here we've got, for example, the minus sign then created. So here we can sort by ascending or descending, and we can then also specify how we want to order or what we want to order it on. So here what we're doing is we're ordering our list that gets returned from the database in descending order. So it means that, for example, the last item that is added to the database is shown first. So I could change that by doing it this way. That means that all the data will get returned in the order it was actually placed within the database. So the first one will get shown first. So typically you want to order your data in descended order, typically, because you want to see what was the last item that was actually added to the database first. Right, so let's move on and have a look at the dunder method. So here we can see we're just going to return the default string of the title. So when we return a piece of data, it's going to say the title of that data. And there we go. So that's our models now completed, or our default set of models. So over time we can add to this list. So I don't recommend you starting out adding loads of data to this. I am going to be swapping and changing this around. So it's best just to add a small pieces of information until we've completed the product or project, sorry, and then start adding lots of products. So once we finish building our models, so let's just save. Now we go ahead and migrate. Now we're not going to be able to migrate this because it's going to cause an error. So let's just go ahead and do this. So we've got two steps, manage Pi, and then we need to make migrations. So that's going to prepare this code in a format so that Django then can build the SQL to build the tables in our database. And that's all done automatically. So you can see here, there's two problems. I didn't define the user. So remember that I brought in, and I'm saving the user information as part of the foreign key. So what I need to do is just add that into my database. So I need to import that in. So I'll go ahead and do that. There we go. So I've imported the user model from the Django contrib auth models. So this is the user model that Django automatically builds for us. So the second problem, hopefully we'll see this, that we're going to have. So let's try this again. You can see here that we don't have Pillow installed. So you can see here there's a dependency for this image field needing Pillow. So Pillow is a package that we can install that helps us manage images within our project. So let's just pip install Pillow. So it's nice and simple. It's a nice small package. So now that's installed. So we can now go ahead and do the make migrations. So like I said, that's going to prepare a model or the data. Let's go back into here. So we're going to store, we can see migrations. Inside of here, we've got the initial. So you can see here what's happened is that Django has prepared that class in a manner or in a fashion that can now be utilized to actually convert into SQL and build our database. So it's already popped up here, a database. There's nothing in it just yet. So let's go ahead now and do py manage py and then migrate. So that's going to migrate. It's going to take this file and any other data models that need to be built, because Django has some default models that it builds. So you'll see a load of models being built, and then it's going to build up this database. So let's just migrate. There we go. So you can read through that and you can see that all the tables have been built. So now what we can do, as long as you've got the extension I mentioned earlier, the SQLite extension, you can now go into the code here, into your database file, right click, open database, and then open up the tab here. And then we can then have a look at some of these tables. So the product table, let's just right click and show that table. And you can see that there's nothing inside of it at the moment, but that's how we're going to access our table. So let me just put this tab over here so we can access it in a second. Okay, so now we've got that set up, we can now start thinking about adding data to our database. So now we're going to configure in Django the media folder, and that's going to allow us to store images that get uploaded through the admin area in this case. So it's a media folder that allows us to store images initially within our project. I don't see why I keep saying product, in our project. So what we're going to need to do is, let's just zoom out here of our project, and I'm going to right click and create a new folder. I'm going to call this media. So that's going to be our media folder. That's where all the items are going to be stored. Now, just looking down here, you can see our image is going to be uploaded to a new folder called images inside of this media folder. Now, we don't need to build this. This is just going to happen automatically. Django is going to do that for us. So we don't need to worry about that. Okay, so once we've done that, what we need to do now is we just need to tell Django that we are using the media folder. So what we need to do now is just head over into our core, go to settings, and at the bottom, or anywhere you want really, ideally at the bottom, we're just going to add two new statements here, or variables. One's going to be the media URL, and the other is going to be the media route. So these are two settings that we need to configure to allow our media folder to work. Now we are working locally, so this isn't referencing production server. So we are working locally. So we're going to set this up so it allows us to work locally with the media folder. Okay, so you can see what we're doing is that our browser, to access on our web page the media folder, we've set up the URL like this. And so that's the reference point. And you can see if we go into the folder structure here of our project, again, project, you can see the media folders there. So it's kind of pointing to that folder. So behind the scenes, Django might utilize it, the media folder, or we might reference it within the background of our server. Remember that all this code is running on the server and not the user's front end on the browser. So when this runs, it needs to know where that media folder is. So the media route is a path, a direct path. So here I'm bringing the OS module. So I just need to add that in. So I'm just going to import OS. So this is a Python module that kind of allows us access to the path or the root directory or the directory system in your operating system. And you can see here I've got path join, and then I've got the base directory of our project. And I'm going to connect that up to a media to build the actual link to the media folder so that Django can access the folder. Okay, so those are the two settings. So next up, we need to configure the URL. So this is going to be for development only. So you'll need to go over to your core and your URLs. inside of here, I'm just going to remove all this. Inside of here, we're going to need two settings. We're going to need to just import some resources so we can access the settings file. Oh, not those. We're going to need to access the static and the settings so that we can kind of set this up. So we import those resources in, and then we can go ahead and then just configure it so that we can use the media folder. So you can see what's happening here is we're kind of adding to the URL patterns if the settings equals kind of debug. So while we're working in development, in our development area, we've got debug equals true. And that provides us then additional information when we make mistakes or when we have mistakes in our project. And we can kind of view them here in the browser. Now, of course, we don't want that to happen in our production environment, so we turn that off. So basically, why that is true, we're going to be utilizing the internal kind of, we're going to be utilizing media in our development environment. So we kind of set up this media URL, and here we're basically just defining the fact that we're using media URL, and we're also utilizing media route while we're in development area, or while we're developing here in our local area. Okay, so now the media folder is accessible in our Django project. Now let's head over to the admin configuration so we can start adding some products to our database. So let's head across to the store app and open the admin file. So here we're going to detail and tell Django what models we want to access in the admin area. So if you haven't used the admin area before, this is a function or this is a service or feature that Django has pre-built in and available for us so that we can administrate, add new files to our database and so on. So we just need to tell it what models we want to use so we can start adding data to those models. So what we need to do is just go ahead and describe what it is we want to include. So first of all, we need to we're going to need access to our models. So let's do let's bring our models in. So from models, so we use the dot to refer to this directory, and then models is the name of the file models. So that's what we're doing there when we're bringing these imports in, or this import. And then we're basically going to describe what models that we need access to. And there's going to be two of them because we've only got two models, category and product. So now to actually registering our model. So there's a number of different ways we can do this. So this is just one method using @admin.register and then the name of the model. So that's going to tell Django that we want to register this model. And now we can add some additional information. So I built this new class here. And I'm just going to call this category admin for no particular reason. And you can see what's happening here is that I'm just extending from admin to model admin. So I'm now going to give it some more instructions. So I want to basically edit information or want to kind of display things in a very specific way in my admin area. So there's a whole host of different things we can do here. This is just one parameter or attribute we can set up called list display. So here I'm going to tell Django what in the list, what features or what fields I want to show in my list. So I just want the name and slug. That's all really it's available here in the category. And then also what I can do, because I'm using the slug. Now remember, the slug is like an identifiable keyword I can type into my URL. So I want that keyword to be similar to the actual category. So why not just use the category name? So what I can do is I can go ahead and create something called a pre-populated fields. So I can specify fields that get pre-populated or populated based upon whatever I type into another field. So the slug field will get populated automatically when I type something into the name. So that's what's going to happen there. So I can then go ahead and now just set up the product. So same kind of code here. I'm going to register the product model and then build a simple class So this class here is going to allow me then to extend again. And then from here, I can go ahead and just manipulate and change what it is I want to display in my list. I can, for example, create some filters. So there's going to be a lot of products here. So I want to be able to filter the page. So I can go ahead and create some filters. Django will do the rest for me. So it knows what type of data this type of data is, and it will set up the filter for me automatically. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about the admin area, there is an admin series. So have a look at those tutorials. I'll go into a little bit more detail. So in addition to that, I'm going to have an editable list, and then I'll also add some pre-populated fields again. Okay, so you can definitely go and check out the documentation, what this means or what this does in a little bit more detail, but it's pretty much self-explanatory potentially, in some cases at least. I do apologize if it's not self-explanatory. I probably shouldn't have said that. It's self-explanatory to me because obviously I know what this does. So I do apologize there. So now we've done that. We've now registered our admin models. So let's go ahead and actually add a new user so we can actually log into the admin. So let's create a new super user. So I type in py managed by create super user, and then it's going to ask me for a username for my super user, email address I can keep blank, password, and press Y because I'm using a very short password of just admin. Okay, so now I've done that, I've added a new user. I can now go ahead and just run the server. Okay, so let's go back in. So to access the admin area, I need to type in admin and then username admin, password admin, and press a category. Now remember, I need a category in order to make a product. I'm not going to be able to make a product without a category. So we can just show you that. Created by title, blah, blah, blah. It's going to say there's an error because I'm going to need a category. So I can just add it here, or I can go back into my categories here and I can add a category here. So Django. Now notice that the name, the slug is being pre-populated with the name. So whatever I type in here, it's getting pre-populated. So that's what that setting did in the admin file. So I press save there, and then I can then go back to my store products and then add a new product. So I've got a category, I've got a user. Remember the admin user I've just built, and then I can just make a new product. So the image, let's go ahead and do that. So we've got this image here called Django. We've got a price, £20.99, and it's in stock and it's activated. So you can see in a second when I press save that all this data here, author, slug, price, in stock, created. This is the list of the product. That matches up with the items that I've kind of identified here in my list display, for example. So in addition to that, if I now go into my media folder, you can see there's a folder now called images, and the image I just uploaded is right there. So you can see that everything is working nicely. So in addition to that, if I go into my SQLite database, which the tab I had open before, so right click on my table, show table, you can now see I've got data in my database, and you can see how it's stored and referenced in my database. There we go. So one thing I didn't mention was Django automatically builds an ID, an auto-incremented number that's a primary key associated to all the different fields. So this is a number that auto-increments as we add more data, and it's unique to each item, which means I can use this number to access this data somewhere else in my program if I wanted to. Okay, so we've got started. We've created a new project, and we've added some models, and we've now configured the admin to allow us to add new data. So now we have this optional element here, testing. So I'm going to just take you through the steps of basic testing in Django, introduce you to testing. Like I said, you don't have to do this. You can just skip ahead to the URLs and carry on there. That's not a problem. But if you're interested in testing, I do recommend that if you're not familiar with testing, to start thinking about testing your code. Testing your application is obviously important to check for errors that you might not be able to test normally, for example, through the browser. Of course, it can also save you time because you don't need to open up the application and test all the different elements you might have in your, and all the features, sorry, you might have in your software. So testing is an important stage of any development to improve the quality of your application. So here in Django, Django creates essentially a wrapper around the standard Python library unit test. So the unit testing framework is a Python standard library. You can go ahead and read a little bit about it if you wanted to, of course. So this provides us all the tools that we're going to need to run tests in our application. And we can access this through the kind of Django wrapper around this Python standard library. So that information might be a little bit abstract at this point. So let's just go ahead and do some simple testing. So here in your application, you may have, and you will have by default, sorry, a file called tests.py. So that file is created by default. There isn't really anything in it, or isn't any tests to begin with at least. So what I've done here is I've just created a new folder structure for my tests, and that allows me just to separate my tests from the main application folder. So just makes it a little bit tidier to find my tests and run my tests. So you can see here inside the test folder, I've created 2 new files, and I can also then, as you can see, logically kind of separate my tests into different files, and maybe I can test different features of my application. So here I'm testing models and my data models, and here I'm testing my views. So here I can kind of logically separate my tests into separate files. So in Django, if I want to run a test, by default, I can just use the manage py facility and just use the keyword test. So that's going to fire off a nice test here. So you can see that Django can't find any tests. Therefore, it ran 0 tests in 0 seconds. But everything's okay. And you can see that it tried to run tests. So by default, Django is going to try and look for files inside of your folders and your project files for files called test. And if it does find a file called test, it's going to then try and run those tests inside of that file. Now notice previously, I do have a file here that begins with test. So you might have assumed from basically what I've just said that this test file or these test files should have been run. So the reason why it wasn't run, because we need to include an init.py file inside of our new folder to ensure that Python essentially looks inside of this file or folder, sorry, for any files. So now I've done that, let's go ahead and just run the same command again. And you can now see it's run a test because I do actually have a test already created in one of these files. So you can see what happens when we run a test. Notice that there's a dot here indicating kind of a block of tests that we've run, for example. So I've ran one test and this is how long it's taken and everything is okay. So the test I run is working okay. Or should I say the test that is run has passed? That's probably more correct. So it's not always easy to know exactly what tests you actually need to run, at least to begin with. So what can help you along the way here is to utilize coverage, which is a package which essentially scans your files and looks for where tests might be required. So I think it's always a good start to utilize this program. It helps us kind of visualize and identify where the tests are needed. So let's go ahead and pip install coverage. So I've already installed it, so it's going to say I've already installed. So I've got that running. So what I can now do is run coverage. So instead of running manage.py.test, I can run coverage, run, and then manage.py, and then test. So again, it provides the same information here, but behind the scenes, coverage is scanning all my files essentially and looking for where tests are required. And I can then pull up that information, or should I say I can see the results of that by typing in coverage and then report. So that will give me an overview. There we go. So you can see that it's looked for all the files in my folder here, my project folder, and it's found where potentially tests are required. And these numbers here indicate how much testing has been completed. So 100% means that everything has been tested. And anything below that means potentially there is a test that's required. But notice here, it's finding all these files inside of the event folder. So it isn't my concern what's inside of the event folder. It's not really part of my project. This is just part of the virtual environment. So further up the top here, we start to see some of the files that I have in my project. And there it becomes a little bit more important to take a look at what code potentially requires testing. Now, this is a little bit messy. So what we can do is we can omit any kind of files or folders that we don't want to run with coverage. So let's go down to the bottom here. Let's just run this command. So coverage run, and then you can see here I'm using omit, and then I'm going to omit the event folder, and then just run the tests as per normal. So I'll do that again. So the outcome is the same because I've already created a test, which I'll show you in a second. But now when I run the report, it's a much more structured report without the event virtual environment folder. So here we go. So the manage.py file here is a Django file. So it's not really my concern about testing at this point. You can see that the models file requires 2 tests potentially, or is indicating potentially there's 2 tests that are required. So it looks like that's my main focus at this point. Now, what I can now do is I can run not the report, but the HTML, and that's going to create a new folder in your project called html.cov. Now inside of here is an index file, and if you open that up in your browser, it's going to look a little bit like this. So we can kind of get the overview index. Let's just run that index again. So we get the overview of the tests that are missing, and then I can drill down to the models, and then it then indicates the tests that are missing in red here. So this is suggesting that I need to just check or make a test to ensure that what gets returned from the database, the default name is the name of the item that is returned. So that's something that we can definitely set up, and I'll take you through the 2 tests that we can perform to achieve that. Now, this is where it gets potentially a little bit more complicated, but essentially what we're trying to do here, if you've not done testing or are new to development, is that generally in our program, we make logic. We say that if 1 equals 1, then do something. For example, we make conditional statements to run code. We create logic to perform actions and to return data. And what we're trying to do in our testing is to ensure that the information that should return in these conditional statements or should return on the page, or the data that should be collected from the database and calculated together and outputted, this type of functionality and logic that we're building in our software, we want to test that to ensure that what should be the outcome of that is the outcome. Of course, it's not just in our software testing to ensure the correct outcome occurs. We can also test to make sure, or to test against, if the wrong outcome is also produced. So let's take a look at a simple test. So inside of our models here, test models file, you can replicate this. You're going to see a single test. So this is essentially how to, or the anatomy of a very simple test here. So you can see Django, from Django test, we import test case. So test case, like I suggested at the start, is a kind of a wrapper around the Python standard library. But Django provides us then some Django facility that we can use, and it ties up nicely with the Python standard library. Okay, so when we run tests, what we got to imagine is that we are running tests on our system. Now, the tests here can access all of our views, all of our logic, etc. But generally what happens is that when we run tests on a separate database. So we've made a database already, but we don't run tests on our production database or our main database. The testing setup here will automatically make a copy of that database or the structure of that database. And in our tests, we're going to have to create some separate data to run tests on. So similar to what we do in the views, for example, when we access data in our database or models, we need to import these models in. So our functionality in this page here can access our models. So you can see here from the store, referencing our application, models, import the category and the product model. So we import that in, now we have access to those models. So now we have those models, the testing, when it starts up, we'll create a copy of that and then produce a database which we can then insert data into. So you can see here the first line, we have a setup. So typically you'll see a setup. So the setup normally is a stage in the testing, which you then create your data, which you then want to test against. So what we've done here is in the category table, we're using the default object manager, and we're going to use this keyword create to create some data. Now in this model here, if you remember in the models file, we have two fields, name and slug. So all we've done here is we've set up our data to insert two pieces of information in the same row, or to make an instance, name Django, slug Django. So that's going to go ahead and create an entry into the database, into our testing database. Now we've also kind of created this into a variable here. So notice that we're using self. So if you're not familiar with self, just to kind of generalize what this self is for, at least to begin with, to kind of get a general picture. Here, you can see here we're setting up self.data. So in order to make this available in other functions here, we use self to allow access to this data from other functions and so on. So it just allows us to kind of access other data within other functions throughout our testing or throughout our class here. So now that we've created our data, we can now access it within our test. So notice the testing naming conventions. If and where possible, always try and name your tests something that is easy to understand. Other people can read it and understand what it is that your tests are going to be testing. So this is an actual kind of start of a test here. So we've set out our class, we've set out our setup, so this won't get tested at all. And now we're going to create a test. So notice our test begins with the word keyword test, and this is going to be a category model entry test. That probably doesn't make sense. So here you can see we've got a commentary here. This is a testing the category model data insertion type fields and attributes. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically just take this data here, and we're going to test to make sure that the name and the slug, these fields match our model, which they do, of course. So if we were, for example, add a new field here, of course, that doesn't match our database. So we can test to see if that is going to be inserted correctly. Now, also in our database, remember we set out some different attributes that, for example, parameters that, for example, the name was a maximum of 255. So that's something we could potentially test and to check to see if that is being captured, for example. Now, this isn't probably a test that you would want to build, maybe because this is really just testing the Django, the software package really, or sorry, the Django framework. So we don't really potentially need to test this. Remember, we're only going to test our own logic that we create. So this is just to showcase a simple test. So we've got our test set up here now in this new function. We bring in self, so make it available, the self available, the data here. And then you can see we create this new variable, and then we add the data here from our setup. So we now capture this. And what we're going to do is we're going to run this by the database to check to see if this data will get inserted or not into the database. So we're going to check the data type fields essentially here. So this last line here is actually going to kind of perform the test or a test. So what are we testing? Well, essentially, like I said earlier, if we make for example, an if statement, if A equals 1, do this. Else, if A doesn't equal 1, do this, for example. So in that type of situation, we want to test to make sure that if A equals blah, that it does actually perform that action in our code. So if it does perform that action, maybe the outcome of that is true or false. It might be a Boolean, or the outcome of that kind of statement that we built might be a number, for example. So it's those type of things that we're trying to test here. So we can do that through these special kind of, I'm going to say commands here. They're not commands, but so this is a kind of a library of different asserts that we have available. And this is going to allow us to kind of perform testing actions on data, for example. So equals, assert equal, assert false. So for example, I'm going to run this. I'm going to run this test here. So what I'm doing here is instance. So I'm checking to make sure that the data here actually fits. This is my model reference. So what's happening here is that isInstance is going to take the data. This is the data here that I'm bringing in over here, and I'm going to test it against my model. If the data fits, if it's the right data type, etc., then what's going to happen is it's going to return true. So what I'm going to do now is use assert true. Basically, if this returns true, this test, if it does return true, it's going to be captured as true. Therefore, assert true equals true. So therefore, the test is run successfully. Now I can just use assert false, for example. So if I knew that this would return false, then I can double check. I can check against the assert false, and then the test would return as complete, as successful. And there we go. We've created a simple test. So you can see that there's a number of different asserts here. We can check inside of the HTML for certain code. We'd do that. Less or equal then. Not almost equal. We've got not in instance. So we can check to see if something's in instance, for example. So you can see that there's a lot of different things here. And if I were you starting off with in testing, I would have a look and get familiar with all of these here. As someone who's going to do some testing, because this is going to help you understand or help you kind of develop your tests and help you test different aspects of your software. Okay, so I apologize if that was too simplistic or too difficult. Let's just go ahead and continue, and I'll try and explain for those who are finding this a little bit difficult here. Hopefully you've got an idea from what I've just said, what is happening here. Once we start doing some more tests, you'll get a general picture. And as we start to build our program and do more testing on different things, and once you understand programming a little bit more, if you are new to programming, this will make more sense of the type of things we're testing, and then of course why we're testing. So that's a basic test. And so when we run our test here, you can see we have one failed test now. So the reason why that's failed is because you can see this, it just says assert. So let's just change that back to true. So you can see it also should give us some information. Yeah, it's identify where the problem was in our test. So let's just do that again. And you can see that we've run one test and it's all okay. So let's go ahead and start building some simple tests here for our two missing elements that require a test. So you can see the category and the product, the default return is the title. So let's go ahead and test to make sure that when we insert data into our database and recall it, when we recall it, the default name for that data is going to be the actual kind of name of that item. Right, so back in our test model here, let's make a new test. So we make a new function here called test category model entry. I suppose I could have named that model return, for example. So we're going to test the category model data, insertion, type, fields, attributes. So that needs changing. We're going to test the category model return name. That's what we're going to do. So we already have our data up the top here in the setup, so we can utilize that again. So we're taking that data, and this time we're running assert equal. So what we're saying here with this test is that on the left-hand side should match the right-hand side. So assert equal, so the string data. So basically the data that gets inserted into the database here, the name, the default name should be Django. So here we run the string of the data. That's the data. So the default return, because we've set that up, that dunder string method, we returned the name. So this is going to return Django, and we're going to test it against Django. So it should be true. So let's just make an error first, just to check that. So we run our tests, and you can see that we've got a failure here. So it kind of identifies for us the failure. So Django doesn't equal Django 1. So it's clearly showing us here the return Django, and then the fact that it doesn't equal, not equal, Django 1. So let's just go ahead and just make that true. And we'll run that again, and everything is okay. So remember, Django is being referenced here as the name, and in our models, just to double check, it should be returning the self name by default in the category. So now we've done that, we can now do the same thing to the other model, to our product model. So this is a little bit more complicated, our product model, because it has more fields. Potentially we need to ensure that we've got or we've described all the mandatory field data that is required to actually create a record. So let's go ahead and create a new class here, a new set of tests for the test product model. We're bringing in test case again. We set up some data. So here we're going to bring in the category. Remember, if we're going to build a product, we're going to need some categories to actually connect to because we're using the foreign key. So we need to think about that as we go along. So here we also need a user. So we're going to need to connect to the user objects for the default user model. So we're going to need to bring that up in here at the top in a minute. So now we have that in place, we can now add some data. So here you can see we set up some data again. So product, this time database to product, objects create. And you can see that I've created a category ID equals 1. Now let's just confirm what's going on here. So why does it say category ID and not category? Because if you remember in the model, it just says category. So why ID? Well, behind the scenes, if we take a look at our product table again, you can see that in actual fact, Django has added the ID to the name up top here, category ID. So you can see it's added the ID component to that name. So we just need to make sure that we're using _ID to reference this field. You can see it's using numbers and not the name. So the category 1 represents the first category in the category table, which is the name Django. So we're referencing the category table by the ID and not by the name Django in the category table. Of course, there's only one item at the moment inside of our category table, or there will be when we enter it inside of here. So that kind of sets up that little bit there. So you can see that we've already created a, in the categories, we've created a new object. We've then created, a new admin user. So we've done that, and now we've kind of connected to created by. Now remember also created by in the model uses just created by, but the database is going to be adding the ID here again. So we need to kind of follow that. That's going to equal 1. So that means it's user 1 in the user table, which we know there's only one user, and that's admin. So here we're making references via the ID of our tables to build those foreign key connections. Now I've gone ahead and added slug, price, and image. So these are all mandatory fields that are required in order for our data to work. Now, if we were to run this without adding a particular field that is mandatory, it will tell us in our testing that we need to add that data. So I'll go ahead and just add in the user table so we can access that. And that should just be about it to create some data there for our products model. So now we can build out our test. So let's go ahead and create a new function. We're going to call this test products model entry. So similar to what we've already done, we're just going to copy the same type of format here. So this is going to test the product, the model data, insertion type, field attributes, etc. So we're going to bring in this data here. that we've inserted in the database. Now, just because it's in this variable here, it does actually get inserted into the database, into the testing database that we've created here. So we'll access that and check to see if the instance is compatible with the product, whether our fields and attributes match our product table. So we do that first. That should return true if it's correct. There we go. We're using assert true. And then we can go ahead like we did before and test the string dunder method to make sure that the default return is the title in this case. So we're returning the title. If we go in our model at the bottom here, the string should return the title. Okay, so that should return Django beginners. And there we go. So now what we can do is just run those tests out. Everything is okay. And now what we can do is just refresh our coverage. So we run the coverage HTML again. We can refresh this page and you can now see we have completed all the testing. We're 100%. So that was a brief introduction to testing. We've completed our testing now for our models. We will dip into testing again and progress with the testing throughout this project. So as we go through, we'll learn a little bit more about testing and hopefully you'll become a little bit more familiar and confident at testing your application. So let's get back to our development here. We're now going to configure our URLs and our views and then obviously connect this to some templates. So I'll say obviously we're going to connect the views to our templates and that's then going to be distributed to the user so that they can see the website that we're going to be building. So for those who are new to Django and want a quick overview here on what's roughly going on. I always like to try and paint this picture in your mind to give you an overview of what the general kind of workflow here in terms of a user accessing information from your Django application. So let's remember that Django is always working in the back end in the server. So typically the user will open up their browser and they're going to type in some sort of domain, which then allows you to kind of access or send a request over to the Django server. So Django is going to pick this information up, or this is a HTML request, sorry. So we're going to send a HTML request to Django. Okay, so what's going to happen is Django is going to look at that request and then it's going to try and access the URL that you've typed in here. And that URL needs to be matched against one of the URLs that we need to build. So that's typically the first thing we may be thinking about, what URL we're going to use. So if Django does make a match, the URL that you've typed into the browser to the URL that might be in this Django system here, your application, what happens then is your URL is then attached to a view. So the view, think of the view as the glue that sticks together the data from your database. So in our view, we're going to get the data from our database, whatever data we need for that particular page that the user wants to view. So this is the view. And in addition to that, in order for the user to actually see the page, we're also going to need some templates. So also what happens is that the template will get connected here in the view, and then that information can then be sent back obviously to the user. And what the user sees is obviously the template with all the data inserted onto it that needs to be on that page in their browser. So we can work in this way in that we can build the URL first and then the view and then the template, for example, but it doesn't really matter as long as you've got a template, a view, a URL and some data that can be all placed together nicely in the view. And then the template will be sent back to the user with all the data inserted. So first of all, let's just, now you've got that picture in your head. So remember I said that the user makes a HTML request by typing in something into their browser, a URL into their browser, and that request is attached to some sort of URL. So here, for example, the URL would be this here. So Django needs to make a match for this URL so that it can then be sent to a view to perform some sort of action. So what we need to do in our application is we need to think about what views we need. We need to think about what URLs we're going to need for this system. So we're going to need a URL for the home page. That's just going to be slash the default or nothing slash homepage, the index. So that's going to be a home page. So then we're going to need some sort of category page, maybe. And then maybe this type of format. So we might need to make this type of URL for category Django. That's going to show then all the Django books we have. Then we might need, for example, an individual page for the individual item, the individual book. So we might, something like this maybe, book, and then, for example, the name of the book. So we might need to build this type of structure as well to actually view the book. So let's just do this one by one. Let's just start off by creating the homepage. Now, what we can do here to manage our URLs is we can manage our URLs within the application. So in the core, we have URLs. So we could put all of our URLs here, but it can be better sometimes to separate our URLs into the application level. So what we need to do that is that we need to include or user include. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to create a separate, let's bring that down. We're going to say create a separate URL file inside of our new application store here. And basically we're just extending this list. So let's just create a new file called urls.py. And now what we need to do is just make a reference here to tell the core Django application to also use anything that's in this URL list. So it's also going to check any URLs in this list here. So first of all then, in our core, let's just add a new path here. So you can see that this is going to be the root directory, the home page. So nothing is here. Include. So I'm basically bringing in an include here. So I've brought in the facility for that. And you can see that I'm linking to store.urls, and I'm going to give it a namespace. So a namespace will allow us later on in the program to kind of access our URLs in a more convenient way when we're trying to access URLs to make links, for example, on pages or individual items. Okay, so head over to the URLs in the store. So we started building this. So from Django URLs, import path. So we're going to create some more URL patterns here, just one to begin with. So we're going to need to connect our URL to the views. So from dot referring to this folder here, import views. So that's going to import all the views from the views potentially. Or allow us, access to the views in the view. So we're going to give this as app name of store. Now remember here we had a namespace store. So we're just kind of matching that up and connecting that up to this list here of URLs. So app store equals store. So basically what's happening here is I can, somewhere in my project, essentially say, look at store, referring to these URLs here and not anywhere else, and then access something within these URL patterns. So I'm going to create a simple path here. Again, it's completely blank. So this is the root directory. And then I'm going to connect it to a view, which I haven't built yet. And this view is going to be all products. So I could just call this homepage, for example, and I'm going to give this a name of all products. So now I've got that. I now need to connect this URL to my view. Okay, so heading over to the view, this is where I start to connect everything up now in my project. So I'm working with models. So I need to bring the models in so I have access to them. So from .models, referring to this folder, models, import the category and product model. So that's the first thing that I need to do. Now remember, my function name should be called all products. So let's create a new function here called all products. And basically what I'm doing is I'm taking in the request. So at this point, you can think of this as, like I explained in the diagram, this is the user's request information, for example. So let's now perform some actions. So on the home page, I'm trying to build a home page which has all the data from my database. So that's what I'm going to show. And there's going to be a nice little list of all the books that is in my store. Now, of course, over time, I probably won't want to do that because I might have thousands of books and I don't want to show that on the home page. But for now, we're just putting that on the home page. So the first thing that we need to do is grab the data that we're going to want to show onto the home page. So we do that by running this product.products.all. So this is a query. This query is equivalent in MySQL or SQL, sorry, as select all from products. Sorry, actually I need objects. .all. So this is basically running a query on the products table and collecting all the data. So from product, select all. So it's pretty much that statement in SQL. So now I'm going to save all that data from the database inside of this products variable. And now what I can do is I can make that data available on my template. So what I need to do now is return. So to finish this off, we're going to be utilizing return render and request here. So essentially what we're saying here in this return render request here is that in Django, render is used for loading the templates. So we load the templates and it's essentially a template shortcut. So rendering is a process of gathering the data. So what data do we need to gather? So that's the data that's going to be returned here and load the associated template. So that's essentially what we're doing here with this last command is we're basically telling Django to get the data, get the template, obviously pre-prepare the template with the data, and then obviously send it back to the user. So the key parameters here are obviously the template that we're going to use and the data that we want to display on that template. So let's go ahead now. We've got a template, so it looks as though we're going to need to set up our templates. So we're going to make a new folder here called templates. So let's make a new folder. And inside of templates, we're going to use you can see we're using store here. We're going to use the app name to kind of separate our templates. We may have more than one app, for example. So let's go ahead and create a folder called store. And inside of store, we're going to have a new file called home. So this is templates we can also use within the application locally and within the store application, but we're going to put it into this one folder here, .html. So that's going to be our home page. So now that's all set, I've just typed in home here into my HTML page. We can close everything else up. And let's just run the server and see if this works. So if there are any coding issues at this point, it will indicate that, of course. So let's just go back into our home page. And we're going to refresh. So go back to the home and it says template does not exist. So the next thing we need to do is actually tell Django where our templates are stored. So what you need to do, go over to the core and settings, and you can see here on line 47, it describes the directory for the templates. So we can make a little change there. So base directory / templates, that's where our templates are going to be. So obviously you can change that if you want to another folder. That just happens to be where my templates are going to be. Obviously it's extended with store. By that, I mean, if we go into our store and our view, remember we're saying go inside of store and home. So we don't describe the folder templates here. That's kind of the base directory. And then we go into the store and then the HTML page. So with that in place, just make sure we save. We go back into our project and refresh. And there we go. So that's all working. So this is where we start to talk a little bit about the Django templating system or the Django templating language. Now you can, of course, go ahead to Django and have a look at the template language. And there's a fairly short page here, which you can just read through, which will give you the basics of the Django templating language. So what we can do here, you can see is we can enter a range of different kind of tags and variables and logic, etc. within our template to create a kind of structure of templates to allow and facilitate better usability. So for example, what we can do is if we imagine our page, our HTML page might be broken up into 3 sections. So we have, for example, the header and the footer, and we'll just call this the main content. Now, of course, the header and the footer are elements of your page that you can utilize on multiple pages. So there's no need for us to actually recreate this header and footer on every single page we build, because it means that anytime we want to change the header and footer, we'd have to change all the pages, headers and footers. So we can import dynamically the header and the footer and the middle section of our page, the content of our page, so that we only have one header and footer which we can change, and then the middle section will dynamically change within our website. So typically what we can do is we can build a base file. So inside of our, inside of our templates here, let's just go ahead and build a base file, .html. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically import the home section inside the middle of the base file. So this is where it gets a little bit long-winded, because I'm going to take you through all the different HTML. If you're comfortable with HTML, just copy and paste from the repository that we're using. So you can see here what we've got is a basic setup, which includes Bootstrap at the moment, and I'll take you through that in a second. But we've got this load static, so we might have some static files. Static files refer to, for example, files like CSS pages, which we kind of potentially need to set up for this project, potentially at a later point. And then we have the basic HTML syntax here. So we've got the doc type referring to HTML5. We've got the HTML tag here. Everything is encompassed in that. We've got the head section of our page. So I'm making an assumption that you know a little bit about HTML here. We don't have time to, we do have time, but it would be an extremely long tutorial if I went through every point here. So we've got the title. And notice here we've got this block title and end block. So blocks are important here in the Django templating system. We can override these blocks. So imagine this page here, this block title is called My Shop. So what I can do on another page is I can kind of override this title. So when I'm on that page, we can override this title, block title, with the name of that page. So this is something that provides us some sort of dynamic ability to change on certain pages. So here we've got some links to the Bootstrap elements, which I'll explain shortly, and that finishes the head. So that's kind of the meta section there. And then we've got the body. So this is, remember, this page is going to be utilized on every single page of the system. And what we do is we're just going to import the block content. So here we've got this block open and close, and we're referring to this as content. So what we can do here is on separate page, we can call this page and insert the content of that particular page we're on inside of this section here. So let's just kind of see that in action. So let's go back to the other page that we have here, the home page. I've already made this too complicated potentially. So what I want to do first is I want to extend from the base. So this page is going to be loaded, remember, as per normal. But this time what's going to happen is I'm going to load in that base HTML page. So this is basically going to be loaded in here. Now what I can do, now I've grabbed a copy of that, is I can go ahead and just load any static that I might have, so the CSS pages, etc. And now what I can do is override the base HTML, the base block title. So here I've got block title home. So no longer will it say My Shop, it will now say home. And of course, on separate pages, the category page, etc., you'll want to change the title. So that's how you can kind of dynamically change the title. So at that point, I'm then going to bring in some code for the middle section here. So what I now need to do is open up a block content, and I can also then close it. And then anything inside of here is going to be included on the page. So let's just type in hello page here and just see this in action. So again, my home page is being loaded. I'm loaded in the base. and then I'm changing the home title, to home, and then I'm going to inject my content into this block here, and that's then going to be displayed on the page. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this. Refresh. You can now see it says hello page. Now the styling has changed because I'm using Bootstrap styling now. If I were to inspect, you can now see in the head, it now says home. Of course, we can see it right here. Well, you can't see it there. So we now have home. So you can see where things are being overridden, and you can see where the content is going. And there we go. So that's kind of the basics of the Django templating system. So I feel myself speeding up here simply because there's a lot of content here. So I do apologize. You can always slow me down on YouTube by just moving the notch down slightly, or of course speed me up if you prefer to go a little bit quicker. So now we need to create some sort of design for the page. Now, obviously we're not featuring design here in this tutorial, so we want to prototype as quickly as we can. So Bootstrap offers us a framework, a pre-designed, pre-customized, pre-developed, elements that we can quickly drag and drop onto our design or onto our page and quickly build a website. So we're going to use this Bootstrap, getbootstrap.com, go over to the docs and go into the introduction, and then you'll see the starter template. So you can see in the starter template here that we've got a link to the CSS and to JavaScript that kind of is needed for some of the components that we can utilize in Bootstrap. So all we really need to do here, because we've already built everything else, is just go ahead and copy this CSS into the top of our page. So I do have something here. We're just going to remove that and that. Anything that says Bootstrap, we'll just remove that too. So we're going to need this viewpoint here so that the page scales correctly, this viewport. So we've got this CSS, we'll bring that in. And then we'll also just bring in the JavaScript bundle here. So we can go ahead and just do this instead. So let's just do that one instead. Let's go down there. So I'm just going to add it into the top here in actual fact. So I'm going to load it in first. Why not? There we go. And then all you need to do is just double check the starter template. So you don't need the character set. That's just set by default in your browser on most new browsers, modern browsers. And you see we've got this scale facility here, which has already been placed right there. Okay, so now with that in place, you will see instantly your page, for example, the font here will change or not. So it's already been changed. So your font changes to the Bootstrap font. So that's all good. So what we can now do is go back into Bootstrap and now kind of design our page. So what we're going to do is I'll just show you the fact that we can go into the examples in Bootstrap. We can have a look at any of these items here, and we can make some kind of simple changes to it to fit within our project. So take, for example, we wanted this header here. I could just right click, view the page source, and then go down here to the header section. All I would need to do is copy that across to my project. Still doing it. And then I can press Control and Shift and P and format that. And it looks nice then, nicely formatted, indented and so on. And so I can then go back into my code and have a look. There we go. So I've now got some sort of header bar. So I'm going to make a slightly customized header bar for this project. So I'll quickly take you through the code. Okay, so here is the navigation bar that I've developed. So you can see that we start off with the nav tags here, and that then opens up nicely. We're going to create a container fluid. So a fluid container in Bootstrap means that it's a full width container. If I just use container, for example, it will kind of appear in the middle at a certain width and then continue to be at that certain width. But I want a full length navigation bar. So I've used fluid to perform that action. Okay, so next up inside of here, we have the nav brand. So that's the link that you see. And you can see here we have this button. That's going to be a button that will appear when we get to a certain width, screen width. And underneath here, we then have the collapsible navigation bar. So this is going to appear and disappear when we get to a certain width. So let's just have a look at that in action if you've not seen that before. So you can see here that it folds down nicely, and I've got this nice drop down. That's all automatically being generated by Bootstrap. So that's essentially what that is there. Now these links here, they're being generated. And if I drill down a little bit further, you can see I've got this unordered list here. And inside of here, I've got list items. Those list items are items that are appearing in my navigation bar. And you can see here I've got this drop down facility where I'm going to be displaying some information. I pre-coded this information about the category. So I'm going to select all the categories that I'm going to have in my database and output them. We'll go through that shortly, but that's what you're going to find right here in this drop down. Now, if you're unfamiliar with any of these classes, etc., just go to the Bootstrap website and have a look and search through. And just if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about Bootstrap, just go through the documentation and have a look to see what some of these do. Okay, so there's plenty of different examples. Now you can see here we've got this deflex, which means that this form here is going to be pushed to the right-hand side. So you can already see on the page here that this is on the right-hand side, utilizing Flexbox. Again, if you're not familiar with Flexbox, have a look at Flexbox and get an overview of that. That's going to take you, again, a couple of more hours. So this code is available in the repository, so just go ahead and copy it. Just make sure you copy it note by note, letter by letter, otherwise you're going to have a problem. Okay, so you can see that pretty much in a nutshell explains what's going on there. So that then completes the header. So that's the header section or our navigation bar. Okay, so next up, let's actually get this category list working properly. So what's going to happen is that I'm going to build a drop-down list here, and the items that are inside of my admin area in the categories. So let's just build another category because I think we've only got one. Let's call it React. And let's just make another one called Next.js, for example. Okay, so we've got 3 categories now. So we want that to appear in our list so that we can then navigate to those certain areas. So let's go ahead and just build this out. So we're just going to open up the files. Let's just close those there. Okay, so let's go back into our URLs first. Okay, so we're not actually going to need a URL for this. So we're simply going to collect the information and pass it over to that template. So nothing goes into the URL for this one. So let's go over to the views. Now we're going to build a new view so we can collect that data and have it available on that page or in the header. So I'm going to make a new function here called categories. And basically all I need is a return. So I'm just going to return, and in this case, I'm just going to return all the category information. So I'm going to collect all the category information, and then it will be returned in this reference here as categories. So I'll be able to find all the category information in this reference point categories. Now I do want to make this available on every single page. So to achieve that, if we go over to the core and settings, what we can do is we can add this view here to the content processes. So what that means is that for every page that we view, we have access to that view, the categories view. So we can access the category data through this keyword here, categories. So let's go over now to the base again and have a look at this unordered list here. So this is the drop-down list in our navigation bar. So I've already pre-built the code here. So you can see I'm building this for loop, and I'm grabbing the categories information, which is now available. That view is available through that context there. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a loop So for every time I loop, that data goes into C, and then I can reference any data in the categories table field through C. So here you can see that I'm referencing C name. So that's going to get the name of the item. So each time we loop through the category items, there's 3 categories now, isn't there not? We're going to grab the name, and then I've extended and included title here. And what that's going to do, that's going to basically just provide a little bit of formatting here on the name, so it capitalizes the name of the category. So that's going to loop out, and notice here I'm looping through this code. So there's going to be a list item created for each item we find in the categories table. Okay, so don't forget to add the end for to end the loop there. And now let's just test it out. So a refresh, go to library, and you can see that they're working. So obviously what we want to do shortly is to create some links to these pages so that we can then access all the books within these specific categories. Okay, so before we go that far, let's just focus on the home here, and let's just come back to here. We've got all the data from the database. Remember, this is the home page here that we're working on. So we want just output on the home here, all that data. So we're going to need to build, again, another template. Well, not a template. We're going to need to build the HTML for this. So let's go ahead and start this out. So first of all, I've got this section up the top of our page. Now this code is just copied and pasted from one of the templates. So I'll quickly show you. So for example, if you go over to one of these here, so you can copy and paste this code here, for example, or maybe if you prefer, maybe this here. I think this is what I've utilized. So if we view this, go down into the page, we're looking for a section here. This section here potentially is what we're going to copy across. It looks like the section. So that's pretty much the code that you're looking at here, this simple section here. So just to display it on the page, let's have a look. That looks a little bit like that. There we go. So obviously what we want to build now is this section below here to show all the books. So go back to our code here. So again, all I've done is I've gone over to Bootstrap again. I've had a look at this code here. We're utilizing this. So inspect this, apologies, not inspect. Go over and view the page source. And you can basically just copy this or this page in. It depends how you want it to look. And I basically just copied this in from the main. So section main to main. And that's pretty much what you're looking at on this page. All the code is in the repository for this tutorial. So go ahead and just copy it in. So what's happening here, you can see that I've created underneath the section here, we've got this album here, we've got a nice container. So the container is making the page, the width, defining the page width smaller than the whole width of the page. So as I zoom out, for example, or zoom in, you can see that the page is being retained within the container width. Okay, so in addition to that, we then have another loop here. So this for loop here, now let's just go back into our view. So we return the data as products. So we get all the product data. Now we've got this template, the home template. That's the template we're working on. And now we just send the data to that template so that we can then do something with it. So here you can see we take that data, and for every item, we refer it to product, and we're just basically going to loop out this HTML here. So this HTML refers to a card, a Bootstrap card, which is going to format for us the size and make it look like a simple card that you saw in the other preview. And you can see here what I'm outputting. So product image. Now, if I want to output the product image, I need to remember to include the .url to make that into the URL that's needed to make the link to that image. And in addition to that, we're going to add a link so that we can link to that individual item shortly. We'll do that shortly, but you can see here that we've got the product.title. So all the information that's in the database, all the fields we can access here. And you can see the rest here is just some divs and then some simple styling. So we'll save that. Let's go back into our page and refresh. And there we go, we have our first book. So the image should be displaying that we're using. So that shows that the media is working properly. And of course, what we want to do is we want to click on here and we want it to take us to the single page for that book. Okay, excellent. So far, we've completed the majority of this first page, our home page. So now what we're going to do is concentrate on creating the individual page for the individual books. So we're going to start building the single page that's needed for that. So first of all, then let's just go through the process. We're going to start off by creating in the store, remember, not core, in store, the URL for this new page. So we just need to think about how we want this to work. So maybe we need to think about the path that we want to use. So here I've kind of pre-made this. So let's have a look at this. So we're going to use a path. So for each item, I'm going to use the keyword item here, but this could be absolutely anything you want. You could call this book, for example, or individual item or product or whatever you want. I'm just going to call this item for no particular reason. And now what I want to do is I want to then connect that to the product page. So I'm going to connect this to the view called product.detail. So that's the view I'm going to build, and I give this a name, product detail. Now I'm going to explain this slug item in a second. So let's just head over to the view first and build our view, and then we'll work out what this component is in a second. So let's go over to our views. So let's remember we're going to make a new function here called product detail. So that's going to show our individual product. Now we're taking the request as per normal, get all those details, and we're going to take in slug. So this is the reference point here to slug, and we're going to explain that shortly again. But that's how we want to set this up. And then obviously what we want to do here is we want to get an individual item from the database. So what we can do is we're just going to bring in from the shortcuts, we're going to import get object or 404. So this get object or 404 essentially is a shortcut, another way of accessing the data from the database. And like I said, if the data doesn't get retrieved, it means that we're going to return a 404. So we can build this up now. So we're going to add this in, and let's just move that back. So you can see here, we're going to get the data through the get object or 404. What data do we want to get? We want to get product data. And what do we want that to equal? The slug. And then also the data that we return, it needs to be in stock. That's important. So if the item isn't in stock, then we're not going to show the item. Now let's just go back into our database and I'll explain this a little bit further. So we've got in stock. So if the book isn't in stock, we're not going to show this. So what this is saying here then, let's now tell you about this slug. Now what's happening is we want to make a page which shows an individual item. So here we want to use this slug of the book. In this case, it's going to be Django. And that's then going to show us that individual product. But we need to ask ourselves the question, well, how do we get the individual product? Of course, there's no magic here. What's going to happen is that we're going to collect this here, this word Django. How we're going to collect that is we're going to collect that through what you've already seen in the URL. So item, and then after the slash, we have this slug. So what this refers to is the first item here refers to the data type that we want to store and pass across. And the name of the reference point, essentially this is a variable. The variable is called slug. And then whatever we typed into this space here in the URL is going to be referenced as slug. So essentially we're going to build a variable called slug, and we're basically naming that or referencing that as slug. So this refers to the type of data. This refers to the name of the variable that essentially we want to build and store the data within. So just to make it crystal clear, we're capturing this word here. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that word to make a query on the database. So we collect that data here after the slashes here, and then we're going to move that across into this view. So we reference it here and we bring this in to our view. And then what we say now is this then makes the statement, the kind of SQL statement up. So select from the database, the product database, where the slug equals slug. So in this case, it means that our slug is called Django. So it's going to select the product where the slug equals Django. That's how it's going to get the individual item from the database. Now, remember the slug equals that. So let me just show to clarify that. So in the admin here, we've got the product here called Django, and the slug is called Django. So basically we're selecting from the database where the slug equals Django. And remember, obviously, it needs to be also in stock. So we add that there, in stock equals true, and then that will collect the individual item. Now it's stored in product. Obviously, all we need to do now, I say obviously, all we need to do now is return a template and stitch that all together with the data. So what we're going to do now is build a new template. Now I'm going to put this into a folder, a new folder for no particular reason, other than to kind of manage this more effectively, at least in my mind. So we're going to create a new folder here called products, and we're going to create a new file inside of there called detail.html, for example. There we go. So that's our file. So now what we can do is build up this individual page, and obviously all the data is going to be sent to this page through this keyword here, product. And we can then build up that page and view the page. So let's give this a go. So we start off building the detail page, utilizing the extend. Now here I'm in a new folder. So another reason I did this, just to show you this, the fact that we can also refer to the base from other folders. So I use // to kind of tell Django to look in the prior or the previous folder, go up one folder structure, and then look for the base file. So that extends the base file again. So again, this is one of those pages which has quite a bit of HTML. So I'll try and break this down, give you a quick overview. So in the content section here of our detail page, we have a container. So everything's stored within this container, outer container, and then we have this main section here. So you can see that I'm using a range of different column depending on the actual view or the size of the browser. It will scale down the different sections, but essentially I've got two sections that I'm building here. The section on the left-hand side and a section in the right-hand side, and that's all on one row. So I'm using two sections here, left and right, in one row. So in each section, or at least in the left-hand section, you can see I've got the image. And now I don't need to loop through this because I'm only producing or returning one item. And so I'm outputting the product image URL on that page there. And then in the bottom or the right-hand section, sorry, you can see that there's quite a lot going on here. So I've got a title, I've got the author. Notice here I'm using a slice, which means I'm basically taking the description and I'm slicing it. So it means that basically I'm limiting the output to 355 characters. Essentially, that's what I'm doing there. So that's slice. You can see that I'm accessing the data using the doubles always. That's pretty much all that's there really, apart from a little drop down going on here and a button that we'll utilize later on to add to the basket. But have a look through, have a look at the code. You can just copy and paste this across. This isn't a key feature here. As long as you understand what's happening with the Django elements here, in this case, just outputting individual items, and we're just slicing here. So just to reduce the amount of output. We've got the price also down here. There we go. So let's have a look to see what this looks like. So notice that I've gone to item/Django. So I've done this manually. Notice that the actual data isn't actually appearing, which is fairly interesting. So product.price. So let's go back to view. Okay, so I've made a change there. So just remember the data needs to be referenced as product. So I can now refresh And there we go. So all the data is now in place. So I've only got one item in my database, but obviously I can quickly test this by adding a new product. So let's just go to React, admin, title, React. So we can choose an image again. There we go. The price is going to be $10.99, and then we just press save. So we've got two items now. So the slug of this is React. So we can then just go back to our page item, and it's going to be called React. That's what we just built. And there we go. So this is working nicely, but of course we want to dynamically link to this page. We don't want to have to type this in or manually hard code this into our project. So what we want to do now is build some dynamic links. So that means that we want to auto-generate the URLs in our project so that we don't have to kind of hard code them into our code. And of course, these links might change over time. So it allows us to create dynamic links which can change based upon content and also based upon other changes that potentially we make within our code. So go ahead and access your store model. So first of all, import reverse. So this is a tool that's going to allow us to build a URL. So we're going to build that URL inside of our products model. So I've gone ahead and created this absolute URL here. So what we need to do is use reverse. So what do we want to build? What URL do we want to build? We want to build this URL here. So we've already produced an app name, which allows us access or a quick reference point to these URL patterns. And then we've given the actual URL a name. So this is how we can name this URL path. So let's go back into our models and let's add the first parameter in this reverse, which is going to be the URL we want to use. So store, referring to store, and then the product detail, referring to the product detail name right here. Okay, so this is a dynamic element here. So we're going to need to pass that in. So let's secondly pass that in. So we've got a comma, and then the argument that we want to send across is whatever item it is that we currently want to view, self.slug. So that's the slug or element for that individual item. So we're going to extract that down. If it's Django, for example, page we're looking at, it's going to use Django right here and so on. So that's going to build us up that URL. And now we can dynamically use that to add URLs to components within our page. So let's go back to our home page first. Now remember here, we had the link. So the title was in a link, an A link here. So this anchor tag. So we've got the href here. So that's the link that we want to build for this particular product. Remember, we're looping through these products. So what we need to do now is just reference that get absolute URL. So we can do that through product. So again, everything can be accessed through product. So product dot and then get absolute URL. That's the name of the function. Okay, so that's going to then initiate that function and get this slug for, or the URL for this product and all the products that gets looped out. So let's go back now into our application, go to home and just refresh. So what we should have now when we click here, you can see at the bottom here, the link that's going to be produced, or maybe you can't. But anyway, if we just click on here, it will then take you to the page. So you can see that our links are now working for our products. So now what we want to do is exactly the same thing, but for our categories. Okay, so let's go back into the models and let's go back into, let's just copy this, for example. Let's go into our category here and let's just paste the same thing. Let's just paste the same thing in here, this function for our categories. Okay, so next up, we need to build the category section of our page so that when we select a category, it takes us to the individual category and it shows us all the books associated to that category. So we start off building the URL for this. So I've just happened to create a new area called search, and then it's going to then have the this new slug, which is going to be the category slug. So slug is referring to the data. This is the reference point for that data. So just again to remind you, I want to type in here search, and then for example Django. That's going to take me to the Django category and show all the Django books. That's what I want to achieve here. So let's go back into our app here. So it's going to be connected to a function called category list, and I've given it a name of category list. So let's head over to the views now. Now you can see inside of here we have a new view called category list. So what we're going to do here is taking request and the category slug. So remember that's the slug here, which is going to be, for example, Django. So we take that information in. So the first thing that we want to do potentially, we don't necessarily have to, is we want to maybe get all the information about the category. We can do that first, of course. So what we can do is we can use that to find the name of the category if we wanted to. So what we do here is we build the get object or 404. So we want to select one item from the database in the category database where the slug equals the category slug, in this case Django. So that's going to return one item from the database. Right, so now what we returned is inside of category here in this variable is going to be Django. So we can now use that potentially to actually make a query on the products database. So what we can now do is say, well, in the products database, we can say, find everything where, using a filter, where the category equals the category, the data here, which is going to be Django. And that's going to return a list then of all the books that has the category, in this case, Django. So as you might imagine at this point, we now just need to return and create a new template. So in products, I'm going to create a new template called category. Right, so what we can do here is we can reuse potentially the similar template we had here in home. That might be possible because remember in home, that's basically just going to show a grid of items. So let's just copy that into products. Let's just now rename that to category.html. Okay, and now remember that's going to loop through the items. That's what we want. Now we don't want this section here in the category HTML page. So let me just save the view. So you can see here that we've got the template, and then we're just returning both the category data and the products data. So we're returning the name of the category and that we want and the slug, and we're also returning the product information. So let's go back to the category.html page. Here we go. So we're getting the product absolute URL. That would be useful. So we can keep that in. So let's just run this and see if it works in actual fact. So search in Django. Okay, so template does not exist. So maybe we've got a problem here with some naming. So we call this category. Let's have a look in the views. Category.html. Now store products. So store products category.html. So it doesn't look like it's finding this template here for some reason. So I think what the problem is, if we go into categories, we need to remember find the base template by using the double dot and slash. That's what the problem is there. So let's go back and refresh. And there we go. So this is Django, and there's one book. Now there's how many books in React? There's one book in React. How about if we go home? We've got 2 books. So what we need to do now, we've got the category section working. We just need to make these and build these up into the links so that they now link to the specific categories. So it's the same situation again as making the links for the products. So let's go into our models in our store, and then we're just going to basically build up a new, I've already done it here, build up a new reverse here. So what we're going to need to do is collect the URL from the category list. So we're going to use this URL. Now we need to dynamically add this second component here as the slug. So go back into our code here. You can see that we've passed in the slug argument here into the second component to build up our link. So that should now be in place. So let's go over to our, it's going to be our base, isn't it? So let me just close all these. So we need to go over to the base, and then we just need to add the here in 55. And this is all the drop down items. So for each drop down is a category. So what we're going to need to do here is just add in our new reference to that function. So let's remember we're referencing each piece of data via C. So we're going to need C and then absolute URL. That's going to then reference the model function. And there we go. So let's have a look to see if that works. Refresh, go to library, go to Django, and there we go. Let's go to React, and there we go. So we haven't got anything in next, so it doesn't show any books. And there we go. So at the moment it says all books, but of course it's not all books. So if you remember when we sent the, let's have a look in the view. Remember when we passed the data back over to the category page, we also sent across the category data. So what we can do here is we can output the actual category name. So let's go into our category template here where it says all books. Let's go ahead and change that to the category name. So we access it through the category keyword and name. And I'm using title again in order to capitalize the first letter in the name. So if I go back now and refresh, there we go. Now it says Django, now it says React. So again, I find myself apologizing. Hopefully that wasn't too quick there with the HTML and CSS templating. All the code, like I keep saying, is in the repository. So go ahead and download. There might be a few different changes that you'll see in the repository where I've added some little elements that I didn't include. For example, some different links in different places, etc. So if yours isn't working, then just go ahead, have a look at that repository. So at this point, if you want to, you can now go ahead to part 2. So have a look at that tutorial where we start to build the shopping cart. Now, stay if you want to learn a little bit more about testing. Next up, we're going to have a look at testing the views and just some of the other techniques that we can utilize to do that. And then finally, we will go on to the Python style convention. So we just test our code against PEP8 to make sure that we create some consistent code following the style guidelines. Okay, so next up then we have testing, like I previously said. We're looking at building some tests for views. Now there are some different techniques and different approaches here to test views because it is slightly different. And we are testing different things here than if we were to test what we previously done, the models. So let's go ahead and have a look at some of these techniques. So let's start off by running coverage. So I'm going to emit the event folder again. So coverage run, emit event, and then manage by test. So let's go ahead and do that. So I've run 2 tests. So let's now open up the coverage HTML and let's just see what it provides us. So remember, you'll need to go into the folder here, HTML cov folder, find the index and run that in your browser. So let's take a look at that. So I've gone ahead and had a look at the store here. So let's just go back to a list here. So we've got this coverage report, and you can see that I've been working on the views, or we've been working on the views. It looks like there are some tests missing. Now it seems to be there's some tests missing also. We need to test the reverse here in the model. So that's some more tests potentially we need to also build in the model. But let's have a look at the views. Looks like there's 8 missing tests. Now this may make a little bit more sense here why we might need testing, because we've set up here some custom views. And in our views, essentially what we've done is a 2-stage process. So we've identified the data that we want to collect from the database, and then we've prepared that data in the template and provided that to the user. So what we can do here is test to make sure the data that we're collecting from the database is the correct data and fits our template and successfully creates our template and then potentially then returns it to the user. So that's something we can actually test. Let's test to make sure that it actually works. And of course, what we're doing here is we're also testing the URL to make sure the URL works. That's something else we can also test. So a simple test here, for example, is we can just test to make sure that the home page actually appears, or the user is actually able to access the home page and return it in their browser. So these are all important tests to capture, because before we actually put or deploy our application to the server, it's probably a good idea to actually test to make sure that the home page is actually working, or the pages are actually working. So it seems like some very productive tests that we can build here. So let's start off by going over to our store. I've already created this file here called test views, and inside of here I've started to set this up. So I'm going to bring in the test case so that I can perform some tests. I'm going to bring in the database, the user database, because I'm going to need to build a database again here. I will not build a database, but build the data for the database, the testing database. And I'm going to bring in the models, category, and product. So similar to what we've previously done with the models, we're just going to bring in all that resource so that we can start building and making data for our tables so that we can test upon it. So something I wanted to show you before we start testing is unit test skip. So this provides us a facility to actually skip tests. So for example, here's a simple example class skip test skip, and we've got this one single test here. Now by declarating here with skip and then just describing why you're skipping this test, that allows us to identify tests that have been skipped. So if I were to now perform the tests again, for example, there we go. So you can see, for example, oh no, let me just save that. So going back here again, you can see that it's skipped one test. So we've got this S to indicate the test that was skipped. So you can see here potentially that tests are done in a certain order. And you can see this order here, that the S is at the end here. So it looks like the tests in the models is done first, and then the tests in the views. So that's something that you might down the line want to start to think about changing the order of your tests. But that indicates that the S is for skip. And you can see here it clearly identifies that we've skipped one test. So with that in mind, that allows us to identify tests potentially that maybe we need to update. Maybe we've updated some code in our project and we haven't had time to complete the tests or change the test. So maybe we want to skip it for now and come back later. And that clearly identifies that we've done that. If, for example, I were just to kind of highlight this out, then I won't get an indication of the fact that I've skipped a test. I maybe forget to run that test, and then that might compromise my application. In our views here, we want to kind of simulate a user accessing the view. We want to maybe simulate a user going to our page and accessing our views, etc. So we need a tool to do that. So there are two options. The first option here is from the Django test, we have client, and that will allow us to kind of simulate a user in a test. So from Django.test, we can import client. Of course, you can head over to the testing tools, or anything that we've mentioned here. You can just search within the documentation. It's likely you'll find some good documentation here in the Django documentation. So here it talks about the test client. So the test client is a Python class that acts as a dummy web browser, allowing you to test your views and interact with your Django-powered application programmatically. Okay. The first test that we're going to perform is just to test the homepage. So let's just set this out. So we're going to set this new function here called test homepage URL. And we've added some documentation here. So what we need to do is we need to use the client to actually then send a request to our Django application, in this case, the homepage. And that's then going to retrieve all the data that is returned from the homepage. And then we can perform some actions or perform some tests on that data. So let's go ahead and do that. So we set up this variable. I've just called it response. You can call it whatever you like. And we're going to use this client here. And we're going to use a GET request, so HTML GET request to this location in our project, which is the homepage. And then we're going to return this response and then store it here in response. So now we've got that, we've got the ability now to actually test response codes. So hopefully we get the general idea here. So let's go ahead now and actually build this up. So I've created a new class for these tests. So we're going to have a little bit of a setup here for this. So we're going to need to set up the database shortly, but let's just go for a simple setup. I'm just going to bring in the client, self.c equals client. So I'm going to access the client here as C throughout my tests. So now I can go ahead and build my first test. So we're going to test, as I previously mentioned there, we're going to test if the URL works correctly. So here I've just created a new function called test URL allowed hosts. There we go. That's going to test to see if we can access the home page. And like before, we're going to bring in the response here. So response equals, and then we're going to reference the client as C, self C. So we're going to try and get with this client the home page, and then what we should return is the, let's just type this out. We want to use an assert equal. So we're going to use the assert equal. So there's two parameters here we need to set up, or two things here we need to set up. We need to set up what we're going to compare if they are equal. So we're going to need the response. So inside of this variable here called response, and you can name it whatever you like, we're going to look for the status code. So what's happened here is that when we make a request, a GET request to this page, what's going to return from the server is the status code. So if you're not familiar with status codes or HTML status codes, just go ahead and have a look at this page here. This is HTTP response status codes here from the MDM web docs. This is going to take you through some of the basic responses that we receive from the server. So this is something that actually happens in your browser. So if you were to open up your console, you can refresh and see the responses, see the status 200 here. So that basically says that we've retrieved the data, or we've that everything is okay, the pages has returned correctly, for example. So that's the HTML status for all these different resources. And you can see here that we've got this 304 status, for example, on different items. So these messages here that get returned from the server, from this page, for example, they mean something. And this is basically a run through of some of the more popular and lesser known status responses. So what we're trying to receive here is the 200, which is okay. The request has succeeded. So that's the return that we're trying to return here when we access the home page of our application. So we're just going to assert equal. So we're saying that this here, this response code that gets returned from and stored in our response variable should equal 200. So we can probably now go ahead and just test that out. So if I bring up the console here, and we seem to have an error. Self.client 917, unexpected indented block. Okay, so well, that'll be why. Okay. Okay, so now we've got okay. So everything is run okay. Everything seems to be working all right. So everything is okay. So let's go ahead and break this. So let's just return, say, a 301 status. And you can see that that will then cause an error. So you can see what has been returned, 200, and that is not equal to the 301. Therefore, it's caused an error. So clearly, by running this test here, it's suggesting that our home page is working okay, and we can move on and build another test. So just going back to our page, let's just run our server. So my shop here. Now let's remember that this is a URL that we've set up, item/Django. So we want to test to make sure it's returning the right data, potentially here, or it's just returning something potentially. So we want to kind of set up a test now to check to see if, for example, the item is returning something. If we were to enter a parameter here, remember this is the slug item here. So we need to test that out. And also we can also test the search and In this case, this is obviously the categories where we can have React and we can have Django. So these are two tests that we need to build. So let's go ahead and test the product detail. Now, what I'm going to do here, if you remember in the return test, so in the coverage, it suggested there was a missing test here in the model. So these reverse needed testing. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to test this reverse here, this product reverse first, and then I'll probably build a test for this. So this is going to test not only if the URL is reversed and we can then access, so not only going to test this piece of code here, but we're also going to then test, because that obviously returns a URL, we're then going to test whether the actual page works as well. So we can kind of buddy up the test here. One test if this works, the reverse works, and also then if the page resource will return 200 response. So back into the code, let's go ahead and do this. So we're going to need another function here. So I'm going to name this test product detail URL. So what I want to do here is set up a response. So similar to what we've done before here, let's just set this up. So response, and it's going to be a get request, a HTTP get request. So I want to run a reverse. Okay, so I'm going to probably need to bring this resource in because I want to run this. So let's just put it there for now. So this is all going to get tidied up later on. I'm going to show you how to do this. I'm kind of purposely messing this up, the order of these imports. So we're going to need to reverse. So then we just need to kind of follow the existing code almost here, because we just need to work out what we want to reverse. So almost just taking the code from our models, wherever our models are, and let's go over to the products here. So we can pretty much run this code right here, but of course we're not going to get self-slug. This is where we're going to change that argument to whatever we want. So I'm going to run reverse, and then I'm going to need to open up. Oh, don't know what's happened there. Let's put this in here. Okay. So this case, the argument is going to be Django, for example. So we save that. Okay. So there we go. So we've requested this, essentially we requested this URL, store product detail, and the argument of Django. And that's then going to create this URL, which can then be utilized to access the page through C, utilizing the client. And that's then going to be returned. The page is going to be returned into response, similar to what we've done here, but just a little bit more complicated in how we're actually fetching the URL or generating the URL here. So now we've done that, we can now obviously test this. So let's just copy and paste this down again. Let's just move this across. So let's just move this down again. So again, we're just going to use the assert equals response status 200. Now, before we run this, the problem we have here is that we don't actually have any data in our database. So we need to bring in and tell the testing that we're going to need the database or a copy of a database. So it's going to develop the testing database that's going to be utilized for these tests. And then we need to insert some data. So you can copy and paste this from the previous tests here. So let's just bring this in. So we're going to need to set up the user table. We've already brought the tables in up here. So the user table, create a new user called admin. And then we're going to need a category, remember, because we can't build a product without the foreign key dependencies, category and user. So we built this, great. And then we created some data. And then we go ahead here and we've created a new object. So category ID 1 and then title Django, created by ID 1. That's the other foreign key. And then slug Django beginners, price, blah, 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 and image Django. So let's just concentrate here on the slug, because what we want is the slug to match the argument here. So let's go ahead and put that in there. So there we go. So we've set up now the data for this. like I said, that's just a copy and paste really of the previous code that we've previously made. So all the data now is ready in the setup, and now we can then use it for our tests here. So we can now perform this reverse here and hopefully return a status code of 200. So let's just give this a go. So I'm going to stop the server. There we go. So it looks like it's working. So let's just change this to 300 just to double check. And there we go. It's failed at that time. You can see that we're expecting 200, but it's returned 300, or we've compared it against 300. So that doesn't equal. So it's returned an error or failed test. So let's just go back and run that test again with the 200, and everything is okay. So here is suggesting that reverse in the model is going to work okay. And it's potentially suggesting that this page or this resource accessing the individual products, it looks like it's going to work okay. So what we can do here is we can just copy this, and we can do exactly the same thing for the categories. So this is a test category. Detail. So test category. Response status. So here we just need to change the reverse. So let's just go into our models, go up to the category here. So we just need the store category list. Remember, that's connecting to the URLs. So that's a reference point in the store URLs, and then that's the name of the URL. So let's just go back here and change that. There we go. So the argument here isn't going to be Django beginners. So let's just go back to my data here. So the slug is called Django. That's the slug for the category. So I need to use that slug to match the data that we have in our database. And now I can just run this test. Looks like it's working okay. And obviously I can double check. So that was failed. So it looks like it's working okay. Good. So it is possible for us to actually return the HTML from the resource, and then we can test that HTML against something to check to see if the actual page is the correct page, or whether something that should appear in that page is actually appearing in that page, for example. So let's just go ahead to kind of make a HTML validation test, for example. So I'm going to call this test homepage HTML. And what I'm going to do here is bring in a new resource called HttpRequest. So let's go ahead, and up the top here, we're just going to import that from Django HTTP. So just bring that in there. So I brought that resource in, so we have access to that. So this is fairly interesting, because what we can do with this HTTP request is essentially we can use the views or send a request directly to our view. So let's go into our views here. We've got this view here called all products. So what we can do is we can send a test directly to this view, or we can send a request, a HTTP request directly to this view. So let's go ahead and see that in place. So back in the code here, we've already started to set this up here. Let's go back into our view. We're going to make a request, and we're going to use the HTTP request function for this. So we're going to need to bring in the view first, because we want to access the view. It seems like a good idea to actually bring in the view. So from store view, let's bring this in. From store, then the views, import the all products. So that's the view that for the home page. Okay, so that brings that in. So we can now access that. So we can send this kind of, or we can simulate a request to that view by creating a response, or setting up a new variable here called response, and then basically detailing or referencing the view, and then sending across the request, which is obviously a HTTP request. Okay, so essentially what we're doing here is we're doing the same thing here with client, but we're just accessing the view kind of directly here. We're sending a request directly to the actual view. Okay, so what we can now do is if we need to, for example, we can decode that response here. So response. So remember, we've sent the request to the view here, return back in the response. Now we can take that and we can then decode it into UTF-8 or whatever format we want to decode it in. Now the default should be UTF-8 anyway, but just added that in. So what we can now do is what we find in this side of this variable here is all the HTML that's been returned from that page, in this case, the home page. So what we can now do is we can check within that page to see what we've got. So actually, let's just do a print here, HTML. Let's just see this in the console. So I'm going to run the test. There we go. So you can see I've just printed out what is returned here. And that's essentially just all the HTML from the home page. So what we can now do is we can run tests for items that are on this page here. So we can check to see if data's inside of this page or not, and so on. So it provides us an extra level of testing. Okay, so let's just go ahead now and do a simple test. We know that the title should be home, so we can run an insert in. So we're saying this text here should be in this variable, the data in this variable here, which is obviously all the HTML code. So we can check that, for example. We can also do a starts with, for example. So just quickly show an example of that. So the page should start with, and it should start with this here, for example. So we can kind of check that. So notice that I've removed the white space. So we can also do the assert equal, because we can also access, like we've done before, the status code. So let's go ahead and do that. So there's 3 simple tests that we can run there. So let's go ahead and run those. Looks like everything is okay. And it looks like our page is working. So we can double check that, of course. Let's just change that to another name. See if that's working. Returns an error. Looks like everything is going well. So I have included a final example here in the testing. I just wanted to introduce you to the idea of what Django considers advanced testing topics, the request factory. So to kind of generalize here what's happening, we previously used the client within our testing, which essentially is kind of simulating the browser and then returning the data from the program as if we were running the browser and requesting the data. Now that's not always the best way or best approach to test the actual functionality of our code. So this request factory facility or tool allows us to test the view as a functional piece of code. So as it says here, this means you can test the view function the same way you would test any other function. So it allows us to kind of go into the code and test the function as a function, rather than to kind of go through the approach of the browser. So let me just give you an example, and this is something that we can introduce further in later topics, etc. But it's worth highlighting, I think, at this point and asking you to potentially just read through this and having a look at some of these approaches that this test factory provides us. Because if you were to look at other materials, it's likely that this will pop up as a subject or an approach for testing. So let's pretty much perform the same test as we've previously done here, where we've requested the data. Let's do this, but with the factory. So first thing that we're going to need to do is just bring this in. So let's go to the top here. So we've got the client, we're bringing in the client, and we've also got the test case. So that's all coming from the same place. So let's just buddy this up. So we're bringing the request factory. Yep, let's go back down here and now just build this out. So we're going to need a new function here. So we're just going to call this test view function. Okay, and so we start off with the request. So we have request, and then we bring in the factory, self.factory.get. So we are referencing it like we previously done with the client. So we need to go up here in our setup and just set that up. So we're referencing or accessing the request factory via self factory. So self factory get. So we're using factory to get the URL here, item and Django beginners. So pretty much now the testing looks exactly the same. So we're going to use the all products again to send that request. And then pretty much from there is exactly the same code. So we can just move that down. And there we go. So you will find that there's lots more different tools and facilities. Of course, I'm just really introducing this idea in this example here, but you can potentially see how powerful this potentially might be and how useful this will be to kind of test out your functions inside of your views and look for kind of specific functionality that you want to test within your views without having to go through the browser and so on. So obviously there's a lot of logic in our views potentially that we might want to test out. So it seems like a good idea to have direct access to those views. So there's a little bit of testing. I've gone ahead and I've run my coverage again. At this point, I'm presuming that you know what to do. So I've run the coverage and coverage HTML. I've refreshed my coverage report here, and you can now see it's looking pretty good. Looks like I've made all the tests that I need for my views and my URLs and also my models. Remember, those are the tests that were missing. So it looks like now I've got a good bit of coverage here. So I'm not entirely sure whether that's in place. Of course, these are something that you can just potentially ignore apart from the URLs. But like I said here, this is just for development purposes. So I'm not going to make a test for that. But the main tests I wanted to run was for my models and the views, because that's where I've added some logic in this program. You can see I've now got 100% and we're good to move on potentially. Okay, so hopefully that was useful, that little bit of testing there. Hopefully you've kind of gained a little bit of knowledge and understanding. If that was too quick, I do apologize. Just move through it slowly. Try and make some tests. Ask yourself, I'll utilize coverage to identify the tests, and then maybe use other resources online to ask questions. How do I test this and that, and so on. Stack Overflow, for example. And of course, you can always ask in the comments if I've got time to answer your questions. How do I test this and that and so on? But slowly become more familiar with testing. I think it's a really important aspect of development. Okay, so we are at the final stage, PEP 8, Python style conventions. Okay, so if you're not familiar with this, PEP 8, let's just go over to PEP 8. Let's just type in PEP 8. So PEP 8 is a style guide for Python code. There's lots of different PEPs to have a look at. There's different numbers. It'd be worth having a look at that, or just become familiar with the fact there are different Python conventions and guidelines, etc. So this is basically a guideline which you may or may not follow. So in different companies that you might work for, in different projects you might work in, there might be different style guidelines. Of course, these are just generic guidelines which we can follow for Python code. Of course, they may be different from other types of code, Java, etc. This is obviously for Python. So you can take a read through this. Obviously you can, and that's quite a long read. There's lots of information here. It's useful to kind of follow these guidelines so that we make consistent code, so that we produce code that's easily readable by others. So we're really thinking about here, when we think about style conventions, about readability of our code. So one core area of this, and I made a previous video on this, is the imports, for example. So the PEP 8 guide does actually specify the order of these. And if you think about what these imports are, these are important information to be able to read and identify what imports we've included in our program. And if we to drill down here, what we have here, we have Python libraries, frameworks. So Python core libraries, sorry, here. And then we have the Django resources. And then also what we have are kind of program resources. So here we bring in the models and the views. That's very specific to the actual program that we're building. So we have three clear areas here of imports, and we want to kind of logically create separation between them so we can easily identify them, and then also change them if needed. So it just makes it easily readable. So PEP8 is going to also describe the spaces between the classes, etc., the line spaces, and so on, and the fact that you're going to need a separate white space line here at the end, for example. So that's all detailed in PEP8. Now, if you're not interested in reading it, but you want to make sure your code is nicely presented and follows these guidelines, and so it makes your code consistent, basically all we need to do is pip install some programs, right? So let's pip install Flake 8. So Flake 8, I think I've already got this installed. This is a program that's basically going to scan, check your code to see if it meets some of the guidelines and principles of PEP8. So I can just type in now Flake 8, and then that's going to provide me a list of all the errors, or all the areas where I potentially need to make changes to my code to follow these stylistic guidelines. So that's taking a little bit of time. Looks like there's quite a lot of code. I didn't omit the views. I mean the vent folder. That's probably why it's taken so long. There's so many files in that vent folder. Okay, so that took a good 30 seconds to complete. And you can see that what is returned are these error codes. And it does provide information also. So line's too long. So it looks like the line is too long here, for example. You can see there's lots of different things here, and it's mainly from the event folder. So we need to we need a way of not asking Flake 8 not to check those type of files. So what we can do is create a new file here. I'm going to call this file setup.cfg. Okay, so this is a file that basically we're going to add some parameters to it, and then Flake will read these parameters. So what we're going to do is exclude Git files, migrations, and the event folder. And then we're also going to set a max line length of 119. Now, typically, the line length is around about 79 characters, and this will change depending where you're working, etc. But Django tends to use, and if you look at the Django documentation, it utilizes the line length of 119. So we may as well utilize the style convention of Django. So I've changed the line length, the maximum line length, to 119. So what I can now do is save that. I'll save that. Let's just run Flake 8 again. And now it's nice and super quick. And you can see all the changes that need to happen. So too many blank lines. So let's just do this one, views. Okay, in the views. So this is line 26, character 5, 26. Oh, there's no, where are my test views? Oh, it's in my tests. Test views, line 26, and then character 5. So apparently there's too many blank lines. So this one here, I think that's what it's referring to. So let's just run this again. You can see that now potentially that has been removed, that problem. Okay, so you get the idea. We're basically just following this here, and then you're going to remove all these items. So that's one way of creating better code. And as time goes by, this will get less and less, because obviously you'll be more familiar to some of the problems that do occur, and you'll just naturally code in a cleaner way. So that's going to help you overcome some of the stylistic conventions. It's going to improve the readability of your code. Now, the next item we've got here is, I was mentioning in PEP8, it describes the order, or the ordering here of your inputs. So we can also install an application for this. So this is an application called isort. So what we can do is we can pip install Flake 8 or 9 and isort at the same time. So that's a separate package, which is going to install all those separate packages there. So isort is basically going to look at your inputs. So if I just run isort, for example, it's going to look at all your inputs, and it's going to give you an idea of what is wrong or what needs changing. So let's just run that again, isort, and then isort dot. Let's run this again. So skip one file. So I've used the dot to tell it to have a look at this, where I am now in this folder structure. So look at all these files. So you can see that it's provided me some information. So dot refers to sort all Python files, starting with the current directory. So it looks like it's already made the sort for me. So let's just do this, for example, on this page, because what isort should do is put a space between the different imports. So let's just run that again. And there we go. So you can see that's happening. When I run the isort dot, it's then going through all my pages. So if I go to every page now, it should have sorted all my code. And you can see there's a space between the last parameter here, or the last group, which is kind of the local imports, and then the imports associated here to Django. So if I go into the settings, you can see here we've got some imports directly from the Python libraries, nothing else there. So that's what it's going to do for you. It's just tidying up your code. It's just a small program that you can run, and it just improves the readability of your code. Okay, so that was a mammoth effort. If you've gone through that, if you've completed all the tasks, and you've got to the end, congratulations. Thank you very much for listening right to the end. Now I guess we got to do it all over again in part 2, but this time in the next tutorial, we start to have a look at the shopping basket. So hopefully it won't be as long as this one, because there was just a lot of setup here for new Django developers. Again, if you've got any comments, any improvements that you think I can make, then please leave them in the comments. Thank you again, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.